evening and welcome to the Ops Room, where for the very first time we're here to talk about wargaming in all of its manifestations. I'm Richard Clark and I'll be taking the chair in this occasional series as we talk to game designers, to historians, writers, serving military personnel, and of course to wargamers, to examine and discuss our hobby and all of its multifarious aspects. When we discuss recreational wargaming, we can often find that the hobby means different things to different people. For some, the game is all. For others, the collecting and painting of the figures is primary. Whereas for other people, the focus on history trumps everything else. What does, however, seem to be common across the piece is that when we play recreational wargaming, the one unifying factor is that we do so for the purpose of enjoyment. We're there to have fun. Yet when we look back at the roots of the hobby, we find a beginning in the Prussian military that was a much more serious business. It was, to quote Freiherr von Muffling, the chief of the Prussian General Staff, preparation for war. To discuss the professional military wargame, I'm joined in the Ops Room by Tom Egan. Tom is originally from County Cork in the Republic of Ireland and has served with the Irish Army for the past 15 years and currently holds the rank of Commandant. For the past 5 years, he's been an instructor in the infantry school, a role which has seen him teach on the land command and staff course and instruct in wargaming from a military decision-making process standpoint. We're meeting in the Ops Room today, just a few weeks before Tom is deployed on peacekeeping duties with the United Nations. Welcome to the Ops Room.
Richard, thanks very much, and good evening. It's great to be here, and looking forward to the coming conversation.
My second guest is known to you all, or should be, as a wargame designer who's been producing published rules for the past 20 years. What people may be less aware of is that this individual is involved in professional wargaming, not with the military, but in the corporate world of business. Nick Skinner, welcome to the Ops Room.
Good evening all. Good evening, Tom. Hello, Richard. Yes, very much looking forward to see where this conversation takes us and to put a different lens on what we would normally look at and talk about.
Okay, good. Our discussion today is centered around the use of the wargame in the military and professional circles. It's an opportunity for us to explore how and why wargaming is done when fun and enjoyment are not the primary objectives, and to discover if recreational wargaming, military wargaming, and professional wargaming can learn any lessons from each other. So let me start by asking you, Tom, what types of wargaming have you been exposed to in your professional military life?
Thanks, Richard. Yeah. Well, I suppose the core exposure to it has, in real terms, occurred over the past 5 years, and that's during my time both as a student and then subsequently as an instructor in the infantry school, where I teach on our land command staff course, which is our mid-career course for captains about to be promoted to majors, and it's where we teach our major formal estimate at battalion and brigade level, the MDMP. And a core component to that is course of action wargaming, or course of action analysis, otherwise known as wargaming in military. And it's probably the one I'm most familiar from a professional sense. It's where we look at a particular course of action, a potential solution to a military problem, and we work through it. We analyze its pitfalls, its strengths, its weaknesses against an enemy course of action, and try and understand it a little bit better. And we can talk about that later on, but that's probably the core one. Outside of that, in a military sense, I've engaged with Kriegspiel from a conventional or from a very historical sense. And then outside of that, then we've tried a number of war game type scenarios on staff rides and in shoots. So those are the core ones, and I'm coming at it from a perspective. I think it's maybe an unusual situation. I was fortunate enough that when I did a master's degree a long time ago in King's College in London, that I was able to get some formal academic instruction in wargaming and conflict simulation as part of my MA. And then obviously I've allied that to a long time personal interest in wargaming from a hobby recreational sense. And really over the last 5 years, I've been hugely fortunate that the professional side of the house has very much married up with the personal interests in terms of my historical and my wargaming hobby interests. And all of that, I suppose, has been underpinned by, or at least drawing on some of that long forgotten academic knowledge in terms of on the subject, and certainly looking around scenarios. And it's been brilliant to wrestle with it. And one of the major takeaways as my 5 years draws to a close is that outside of doing the wargaming course of action analysis piece from a military decision-making process, there's actually huge benefit from educational wargaming to be had in terms of officers' higher level education, and indeed all ranks military education and training. But yeah, to draw that all to a close, I suppose that the three big ones are course of action wargaming, Kriegspiel, and staff ride and/or that type of wargaming analysis.
Okay, now that's very interesting, because you just hit on what was going to be my next question, which is really about the benefits that can be had from running wargaming type activities. So tell me, what do you, in your perception, what do you think the military can gain from using a wargame as a tool?
Yeah, I suppose on reflection, you look back on it and you go, well, there's two broad areas where you can pull a huge amount of benefit from, and one I think we do far better than the other, purely by dint of where we sit wargaming, and I have that in inverted commas, yeah, because the terminology thing is a whole other discussion, and that raises its own issues as well. But in the first one, if we can take the defense block at the top and go, well, what does wargaming give us? You can split it down into left and right. And on the left, I would say there's probably analytical benefits and research benefits specific to a given problem. And that can be across policy, capability, or indeed operational planning. And that last part is the bit where I have the most experience of seeing the benefit of teaching students wargaming as a tool to aid their decision-making and problem solving. And then on the left-hand side or the right-hand side of the room, I'd have that educational piece where you can increase or expand the learning and knowledge of a commander or his staff. But in the main piece, and we're certainly we would teach it, is the use of wargaming as a tool within courses of action. And that's part of our decision-making problem. You analyze the problem. In the first step, your mission analysis. The second part is you construct potential courses of action. You understand the specific situation that you're in, and then you can come up with potential solutions to the problem. In the third part, we wargame, in inverted commas, where we do that co-analysis piece. And that's effectively where we take a potential solution to the problem and our understanding of the enemy's likely solution to the problem. And we put them together, and we wargame them out in an adversarial manner. We have some oppositional and frictional factors that are involved within them. And at the end of it, the process is managed by the Chief of Staff with the S2 and the S3, the INT and the Ops Officer, and all of the supporting subject matter experts. We hopefully have deepened our understanding of the likely outcome of that potential solution to the problem, identified some of the pitfalls in it, identified some of the strengths of it, and refined it, looked at areas of risk. And at the end of it, I'd always say to the students, the war game will, in the best instance, assuming the course of action has been fully thought through and analyzed and put together well, it will refine the course of action. Most likely in terms of either effects, assets, time, or space, or synchronization of same. Yeah, okay. In extremis, it'll identify a structural gap in the plan. The plan is structurally unsound. There's a serious chunk of assets missing. Some functional group isn't there. That effect simply isn't achievable, or whatever it is. Yeah, okay. And in that sense, in that operational planning sense, wargaming as a tool, in inverted commas, through course of action, wargaming, yeah, is superb from an operational perspective. In fact, it's critical, yeah, because we look at an actual plan and we go, under these set of circumstances and constraints, is this, or how will this work, and how can we make it better? And that's a really easy one to do, and that's something that we do on all our training courses. It's something that we do in all our operations, and it's a really easy, definable, practical, immediate, tangible benefit to military staff officers. And that's something we can really kind of take away and put in our back pocket, and we can do it.
Tom, let's talk about the playing environment we're talking about here, because you're using some very highfalutin terms, and I'm sure some of the people who are listening are going to be interested in this are from a military background, but majority are not. So when you're doing your exercise, what is the environment? Are you doing this on a map? Are you developing a plan that is then analysed, or are you doing it on a map, developing a plan that is then analysed, and then taking it to the next level, which is wargaming it and seeing what actually happens?
So we'll do a combination of those things. So if I was running an exercise for students, let's say, and we're doing it at battle group level, so a battalion effectively, the battalion staff will set up a command post. They'll have all their various various cells. So you'll have S1, which is administration personnel. 2 will be int. 3 will be ops. 4 will be logs. You'll have the battery commander and whoever else is involved in there. In the center of that room, invariably, yeah, you're going to have a map table, okay? Now, the various staffs, particularly the ops staff, will create a plan based on sketches and acetates, okay? And that can be as simple or as complex as they want it to be. And broadly speaking, 9 times out of 10, it'll use standard military symbols from NATO or wherever else we're taking them. The bit where we get to the wargaming piece, which is that stage 3, the co-analysis piece, yeah, where we take the enemy plan or the adversary plan and we take the friendly plan and we put them together and we, in inverted commas, war game it through to try and find the faults and failings on it, to refine it and all the rest of it. We will do that in a structured manner. So we have a very militarily structured rule set for how you'd lay that out, for the roles that each person will play, for the prerequisites to run the game. So for instance, you need to have your significant factors, which are military principles that we will score the COA against to judge which one is better, maybe has the most likely to succeed. We need a list of assumptions that the game is predicated on, so that both sides are playing in the same space.
Give me an example of that.
That the air situation is not going to change, so that air parity will continue for the period of 48 hours, i.e. in that set of circumstances, someone then can't throw in the fact that I'm going to call in 4 close air support strikes and neutralize your assets, yeah, okay? Or that the weather isn't going to change, yeah, okay, drastically speaking. So a list of assumptions that set the parameters in which we're then going to work this game. We're going to have a list of critical events that we want to worry in, so the snapshots of the operation as we've envisaged it that we particularly want to look at. And we're going to have all those. The chief of staff then, who's the deputy commanding officer, he runs this gig. He's the umpire. He is the arbitrator at the end of the day. And then you have your roles and things. The real key bit, and to answer your question, how we're doing this, well, it can be as fancy or as otherwise as you want. So if you have the resources to do it electronically, by all means. But 9 times out of 10, like good military people, will default to the things that can never fail, which is a map at whatever scale we're working at, an acetate that's layered over on top of it, and then I've seen it ran with Sharpie pens, whereby we're physically drawing in symbols and moving them from location to location. Or we have counters, you know, your standard military symbol counter that's printed off on a piece of card and laminated. Or you might have blocks, yeah, that simply represent a unit, whatever type. And most recently, indeed on the last course that I taught there, we pushed it further, and what we did was blew the maps way up in terms of scale. So we made them huge. And I actually brought in some of my wargaming collection, would you believe, at 15 mil scale. And instead of using a drawn token or a block card, what we did is we used various unit types, so a BMP to represent a mechanized infantry company, an MB team to represent whatever we wanted. We were using those to physically depict units that we're doing. And in that instance, then when we get to the part where we're wargaming out the plan, the staff are simply moving the parts around the table to represent where units are going, at what strength they're at, and then it is verbalized as to what they're doing in those locations. Just makes it far more graphical, and so easier for the staffs to immerse themselves in, and then to visualize the flow of the operation that we're doing. And 9 times out of 10, when we're doing the planning part of the wargaming, that's what we're using. So it's actually, Richard, yeah, very simple and straightforward in terms of how that actually looks. Yeah,
that's really interesting, because I would have thought that once you're immersed in that situation and somebody gets out a toy tank, you don't question it. You don't go, oh my God, I'm not playing with a toy. You go, yeah, great, that's it, a great visual asset. This is really good. It looks like it should look. We can see that it's an armored personnel character, or a carrier, or a tank, or whatever. And I thought you'd have got immediate buy-in from that without any questions at all.
And we did, absolutely. The difference, even from my own perspective as an instructor looking at it, was immense. Like, so I had, for instance, a model of an M109 self-propelled howitzer, which is at some considerable distance to the rear of where our battle group was operating.
Yeah.
But yet, once I placed it on the map, everyone knew exactly what was where and what type of unit it was. Yeah, okay. And that taking it from, certainly the move from drawing in a military symbol, which is flat, and unless you're looking at it from directly overhead, it can be very hard to distinguish, to moving up into just a counter or a hex, a standard hex and counter type game, and then to physically putting a 3-dimensional model on it, whatever scale, made a huge difference. And it made, from the whole staff's perspective, because bear in mind, you could have anything from 10 to 12, 15, 20 people involved in this. So in terms of making sure that the picture as to what was happening and what assets are where doing what and all the rest of it is as immediately clear to everyone as possible, that's a massive boon to aiding the conduct of it. So yeah, I mean, it's a simple. Now, would every unit have access to them? Well, that depends on the resources that they have. But certainly, even from my perspective, in terms of how you do it, it's super simple. It can be done with a map and a pen and an acetate, or it can be moved up through hexes to models, or if you're very fancy and you've got the horses to do it, you could do it using computer simulation and all the rest of it. But by and large, if you're training officers to do this, in extremis in the back of the tent or in the back of an APC somewhere under canvas, this is what you're going to be defaulting to, and that's what I've seen it done 9 times out of 10, and it works great.
My feeling has always been that people like the Ministry of Defence always overcomplicate things. Certainly, I went to a conference of wargamers, which was designed for professional wargamers. I don't know, it might be 8-10 years ago now, and really what it was full of civil servants who were looking for huge computer programs which would do huge computer programming things that would be extraordinarily clever. And I just thought, you're completely missing the point. You are utterly missing the point. So it's interesting to hear.
I'm an infantry officer,
because
Richard, you keep it simple.
Well, you do, and I know for a fact that the British Army had tremendous problems. That they're at company level they were issued with a PowerPoint, but they weren't issued with colour printers. So what's the point? What's the point? So technology can be your friend, but it can also be your enemy, can't it? If red and blue look exactly the same on your non-color printer, it's a vaguely negative thing. Just one thing I'm thinking about there is that, you're a wargamer, I'm a wargamer. I'm used to writing scenarios. I'm used to developing ideas to put in front of my friends in a wargaming situation. Can designing scenarios be a barrier to entry for professional military people who, as we've discussed, you're a wargamer. The majority of people who are told by any military force, right, do this, they're not. Is designing a scenario a potential barrier to entry?
It can be. I mean, the scenario needs to be. The scenario, generally speaking, will need to do many things. You know, and in some cases, it's easier. I mean, if you were designing it for a purpose, well, then all well and good. You just get it to do what you need it to do. In the very first instance, you need to understand what that is. When I'm designing a scenario or a problem, or in some cases, an exam for students, yeah. It's purely related to both what the educational aims and objectives of whatever module it is that we're designing, and then it's linked to those, to, you know, the training aims and the training outcomes. So
which sounds exactly like the games that I've been running that are super jungle heavy, because my objective in developing our chain of command extension for the Far East has been to play test jungle terrain. And if you're going to put jungle terrain on the table and you want people to use it, the easiest way is to make sure the whole table is covered in jungle. So what you're doing is you're identifying the issue that you want them to encounter and you want them to deal with and you want them to find a solution to, and you're making sure that they have no caveat, no, they've got no get out clause.
Yeah. It's exactly the same, Richard. You think about when you're designing a game, you look at what are the dynamics that I'm interested in, what are the underlying currents that I really want to tap into, and then what you need to try and do is figure out what are the mechanics that I need to be able to allow people to experience that. Yeah, okay. And for our instance, it's like, well, if we're writing an exam or we're writing a scenario, that's, you know, going to look at obstacle crossing as a type of operation. Well, what are the core constituent elements that we need to wrestle with? What are the core problems the primary problems that you need to wrestle with when you're looking at something like that? And then when we've taught how to approach that and how to construct some form of an answer to that problem, you know, that's what the elements then that we try and put some of those or capture some of those in the problem. That those could be, for instance, the type of terrain that we're looking at. So I need to find a piece of terrain or a piece of map that will throw up certain terrain orientated problems. When we look at the force organization chart and I say, well, I'm going to ask a student to approach this type of a problem and create a solution to it, well, what are the type of assets that they would likely need? Or how would they use those? Or if there's limitations in certain assets, how would they go about mitigating those? Yeah, okay. And so to answer your question in terms of designing a scenario, the very first thing that you need to do in order to make a good scenario, in terms of the biggest aid to overcoming hurdles when designing a scenario, is to know what you want to get out of it. And thereafter, then, once you've understood that, and that might be easier for us because I'm teaching X and therefore Y needs to be included in terms of how we would go about examining that. It's quite logical in terms of how we would build that. We have a very structured approach to doing that. But yeah, does that answer your question?
It does, and I won't embarrass you by asking where you're training to invade. But my final question that I'm thinking about here is that what I've found a lot with military wargaming is what they tend to focus on is wargaming the planning stage. And then they never cross that line of actually putting that on the wargaming table as we do, as hobby wargamers, and then see what happens. And I think one of the things that we do as hobby wargamers is we don't bother about the planning stage. We just put things straight on the table without having planned. And certainly one of the objectives I had in designing Chain of Command with the patrol phase is to try and get people to go, hold on a minute, I need to develop a plan here. What am I going to do? So before the game even begins, they've addressed the terrain that they're presented with. They've hopefully formulated some kind of plan. So that was a kind of my cheeky beaky way of saying, think about it before you get on the table. So to what degree am I right or wrong? To what extent are you analysing the plan, and then to what extent are you applying the plan in a sense that could be understood as a war game?
Yeah, that's brilliant, and that's where I think, more than sort of from a military perspective, one of the major benefits from a subject matter perspective is to be found within wargaming. So far as, yeah, absolutely, like certainly on staff courses, you'll spend an inordinate amount of time working with and learning to understand the process, i.e. the thinking package, the means of deconstructing, analyzing the problem, and then creating potential solutions to the problem. We spend a huge amount of time looking at that because that's applicable wherever we go. Yeah, it's a process, you know, garbage in, garbage out, or great stuff in, great stuff out, and that gives us a plan. And we spend a huge amount of time doing that. And within that package, there is a huge amount of time, or there is time allocated to wargaming out how you would expect to see potential solutions to the problem done, assuming 9 times out of 10 it all goes to plan. The bit where there is substantially or another significant block of learning to be done is when we cross the start line. And where, you know, things start to go wrong, or things go differently to what we expect, or the friction element comes into play. That red teaming that Nick was talking about, yeah, whereby, you know, a plan can go to plan to a point, and then when things don't go to script or they change, you need to continue to think it through and to think on your feet. And that's where, you know, to some extent, we will have thought through in the planning stage various contingency ops. Yeah. So if X happens, well, we've already thought about that. We have a plan for that written down somewhere. We'll now activate that, and we'll respond to what's coming out. But yeah, we would, I suppose, in my experience, we'd probably spend quite a considerable period of time doing the planning stuff, and then the execution stuff is not necessarily done to the same degree. In real terms, you know, because, you know, in real terms, it's very difficult to take 1,500 people or 1,200 people in an armored battle group or a mechanized battle group or even a light infantry battle group and go and do the plan. That's a lot of people and a lot of expense, and it's, and a lot, you know, and even at company level or platoon level, there's a lot of moving parts to doing that. On the context of doing it in some form of a war game, a Kriegspiel, yeah, using whatever system that you want, there is ample space to go and do that. Now, it is still time intensive. You still need to know what you're doing. You still need to have both sides. But there is massive learning of a different type to be had from that process. And it's probably something, like, certainly I wish I could do more of on a personal level. You know, we could do more of that. Yeah. And I think you're right. I think hobby wargamers do it invertly. They spend an inordinate amount of time doing the execution bit, as in post HR, when we're now shooting at each other, we're doing this, as opposed to the planning pieces. Chain of command is, and I know you referenced that, relatively unique, I would suggest, in that patrol phase bit, which is where you need to look at the table before anything else has happened and kind of go, I need a plan here. Where do I want to end up before anyone starts shooting? Where do I need to be? If I am there or I'm not there, what does that mean to me and for the enemy? All of that stuff, by a million other names, Richard, is encapsulated to some degree at some level in our planning process. We're just doing it in 30 nanoseconds, or you know, wargamers are doing it in 30 nanoseconds or 5 minutes to what we might spend 12 hours doing. Yeah. And then the wargamers are spending the 5 or 6 or 7 hours fighting that battle after HR in the execution phase as they play the war game, whereas we're doing the inverse. And I would suggest, like in both things, probably a happy medium is the place where you want to be. The other piece on the other side of the house is that training and education piece. That's a harder sell. That's a harder sell. For a host of different reasons, I think. Yeah, terminology, immediate returns. What exactly are we testing? Not testing is the wrong word, but what exactly are we teaching or educating? What's the takeaways that we want commanders or staff to pull from it? Yeah. Largely driven, I suppose, by, you know, the level at the game or the simulation is pitched at, who's involved, what we're teaching, what we're looking to get back from it, what the context of it is. But again, there's huge benefit to pull away from that, as long as we can think about those core things, really, like what is it we want, what is it we're teaching, and what is it we want students or staff or commanders to learn. Yeah.
Okay, you've identified something really interesting there, that you've got your 2 columns, and on the one side, analysing a plan, looking for its positive aspects, its negative aspects, how can we improve it, how can we fine tune it, how can we make that better. I think that's very much something that we would all recognize as being what we'd expect you to say, probably. It's the educational piece that I'm interested in terms of, if you were to do something in that area, what would it actually look like? What would we be talking about? Can you explain to me how you would present that? What would people actually see? What would they be doing?
Yes. So on the left-hand side of the column in that analytical research, that's really about helping people, helping officers, helping soldiers, helping military professionals make better decisions, and actual decisions. The educational piece is about helping them make or become better at decision making. Which is slightly less tangible, I suppose, in that it's not immediate to a specific problem. But how we would,
Well, that's interesting, actually, because my experience with working with wargaming in a military environment is that often it's rather like children in the run-up to Christmas who learn how to play chopsticks on the piano, so that when Granny and Grandad turn up, they play chopsticks and go, look, I can play the piano. But they can't. All they can do is play chopsticks. And my feeling often with the military is that they will use wargaming when they have to, because they've got something coming up that they feel that they need to prepare for. And they will do that, and they'll learn to play chopsticks. They'll learn how to deal with that particular problem. But what they tend to shy away from is actually learning to play the piano, is actually using wargaming to develop people and to prepare them for decisions they may be having to make in a combat environment, and maybe in 10 years' time, because you're preparing them at 2 levels up from where they are. So they're if God forbid they're in a situation where the 2 blokes ahead of them get shot, they can take that command level and assume that mantle of command. And that's something that is really, I would, as I say, is akin to learning to play the piano and making yourself a better leader of men, a better leader in a combat environment. Nick, you wanted to say something there.
Yeah, because I think I can recognise so much of what Tom said in the way that the commercial world benefits and uses wargaming. You know, generally commercially, we're using war games to challenge strategic thinking or to test leadership in scenario-based decision-making exercises. And often it's about that scenario, Richard. It's about that chopsticks. You know, is chopsticks a viable scenario for my business? Am I trying to teach my people how to play chopsticks, or do I want to teach them how to play the piano? And copying and getting business to understand the link between the ability to play chopsticks, how that makes you a better pianist when it comes down to future operations. I'm stretching the metaphor a bit now, I know, is part of the challenge, because a lot of it is about the scenario. Organizations, you know, we're going to create a really good low risk environment where leaders can test their strategy and, really importantly, challenge their assumptions. But very often it's about the plausibility of the scenario that's presented in. So if we present them with chopsticks, that's one thing, but it's the ability to then take that and apply it to the real world that is the real gift, I think, of when these things go brilliantly well. And I'm sure from the military perspective, it's the same story, Tom, I would guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's an old adage, I think it was a former commandant of the Royal Military College in Sandhurst said, you know, you train for the predictable and you educate for the unpredictable or the unknown. Yeah. And in many cases, when we're training and using that co-analysis wargaming tool, it's for a specific scenario. We're training for that specific scenario, and that's really what it does. And we're quite comfortable in that environment. The bit where you step across into that educational space, where it's a more ephemeral, like in terms of that the takeaways that you want people to have, that long-term developmental piece, which is what Nick is alluding to there. That's a very different space to be in, and what you're doing there, really, I think, and you hit on it, Richard, is that the takeaways, the major takeaways, is decision making in an uncertain world with imperfect or incomplete or a complete absence of information, being comfortable in that space, working with staff in a time-constrained, pressurized environment. that's relatively low cost that you can fail in, because it's a game, it's a simulation, it's a game. There's not troops moving around the place. It definitely offers all of those benefits and more, in terms of providing that to people. It is, however, I would suggest when you're running that, markedly more difficult to those type of games that you'd run if you were doing it from, let's say, a tutor, a co-analysis war game perspective, whereby it's, if they've done the scenario correctly from our own perspective, then, force ratios and all the rest of it doctrinally comes into place. Well, we wouldn't do that, so it's simply not going to do it here and now. I think in that other free space that you have in a war game outside of the co-analysis piece, that there's far greater scope to engage in that. Richard?
One of the things that we hear an awful lot when we talk to people who are involved in professional wargaming, be it on the military side or on the business side, is they talk a lot about safe spaces for people to make mistakes. It's better that people make their mistakes in a theoretical exercise rather than make them when they're faced with that situation for reality. And that's very true, but I'm wondering if to a degree we are wrapping things up in cotton wool when we attempt to say it's perfectly safe, you can go in there and you can fail. Because surely one of the things that wargaming can do is that they can show us the people who perform when under pressure.
Yeah, this is one thing, very much seen this in the commercial world, where one of the things that these war games are very, very good at is spotlighting that talent, particularly if you're taking what you call the next level down of executives, where you're taking assistant department heads or people that are second tier of managers, and you're putting them in the hot seat, and you're saying, right, guys, this is your challenge, your problem to solve, your strategy to come up with. How are you going to creatively work together in an innovative way, which encourages teamwork, that shows them up to be the kind of leader that they could be. And in commercial activities, this is a real driver for commercial wargaming, is putting those people into that hot seat and seeing how they develop, how they behave, and how they change, because of course people do change when you put them in that hot seat and give them a scenario to contend with.
Yeah, it's a really, really fair point. I think most militaries, if not all militaries, the big set pieces, the training pieces of those field exercises, those are massively costly in every sense of the word, both from a material perspective, resource perspective, a personnel perspective. When you out there, we're training to do things, we're rehearsing things, and it's those exercises are big and costly, and you don't want them to fail. You want them to go well, irrespective of the fact that the officers themselves who are under pressure don't want to fail. The exercise can't really fail. Yeah, okay. If you then transcribe that across then into your wargaming room, Richard, the padded room, as you said, and you can say, listen, it's a safe space to fail. It is. Getting people to understand that, though, can be very different from a cultural perspective. You need to be culturally mature enough, and I'm not talking about our own, I'm talking about in any organization, to be able to accept that. And if your entire career is predicated on going out doing exercises where you don't fail, it can be a massive mindset shift to come into a room and say, well, listen, this is all, I don't say make believe to trivialize it, but there's no actual, we're not spending hundreds of thousands of euro moving battalions of troops around in actual mud doing this. And so if this all goes to pot, well, we'll just pause and reset, and it's all good. Yeah. And that said, I think that leads me on to the next point. You're talking about, at least in my own sense, I'm speaking purely even from, personal sense, military officers are inherently competitive. We must be. We don't like to lose, because losing is not a good thing, where people will lose their lives as a consequence of your failure. And so we are all inherently competitive. And when you put us into an environment, even where people can fail, people don't like to fail. That's not how we're raised or trained. Yeah, okay. And that can be hard to do, because a scenario, a game engine, a simulation, is adversarial. It is by default going to produce a winner and a loser.
Absolutely. And that's a key point that I've observed, again, working with the military. I've attended games and assisted with running games which have been put on by very senior officers for regiments. And the idea is that this exercise is being run for the regiment's officers who are going to get an opportunity to go through and do exactly what you're talking about. But I've been there when the officers failed to turn up, when only the subalterns, the most lowly subalterns, turn up, and they send the NCOs to fill the spaces. And the reason for that is that there seems to be, in some military organizations, a culture where people are scared of failing. And you say that they're competitive. Well, indeed, we're all competitive. But is it competitive to not be bothered to turn up and play the game? Or is that something else? There seems to be a barrier to entry that some people are put off by the idea of a wargaming because they're worried that it might expose them as being not what they're meant to be. And I'm wondering, we've talked about what a military can gain from wargaming, but what stops military organizations taking full advantage of wargaming? What are the barriers to entry? I mean, I guess the word game in itself. Tom, you've been there, got the T-shirt. Tell us about your experience.
I mean, the simple the terminology in the first thing, I would say at a baseline level, the catch-all piece at the exospheric level is understanding. That's the biggest piece. And it can be an understanding of the terminology, an understanding of the intent, an understanding of the mechanics, an understanding of the outcomes. All of that, yeah, is the bit that stops us. The single greatest impetus to overcoming that is I would suggest leadership. Yeah, okay. Insofar as if senior leaders buy into it, then we're a hierarchical organization. It generally flows down the chain from there. Yeah. The interesting thing is though, and I've seen this even in my own experience. Yeah. Military officers, tactical problem. It's your bread and butter. It's what you're professionally supposed to be competent at. Put a tactical problem on a table somewhere and guarantee you they'll all, at them, even in the mess, they'll all gather around it and be telling you, oh no, I do this and I do this and that needs to do this and this is how I'd solve the problem. Put it into a live play scenario, very different. Yeah, because there's risk. Yeah, like you said, there's risk involved. That maybe the scenario doesn't, or that your solution to the problem doesn't play out the way that you want it, and that you might be, your ego takes a battering or your professional pride takes a battering. Yeah, all of those things play into it. Yeah, and there's obviously there's in any job there's the hecklers from the sidelines. Yeah, but and the game. I mean, game doesn't. On a war game, if you're just in the broadest sense, a military professional, war is the piece that you're there. That's the formal centerpiece of your study, of your professional life, be that and in all its forms, even my own sense. War in terms of engaging with it from a peacekeeping perspective, inserted into a conflict of whatever type. Yeah. If you go war game, are we trivializing the topic? Is the game a worthy pursuit of spending 2 or 3 hours?
Interestingly,
for professional officers, I don't know. That is something because game in any sense, even stepping out of the military word, brings its own connotations, right?
It does, and it's interesting that apparently von Reiswitz, who wrote the first set of Kriegspiel rules, didn't like the word game, but couldn't think of anything better. So he stuck with it out of default rather than because he liked it. Nick?
Yeah, I was going to say from the commercial side, it's interesting because games are now generally accepted as a way that we can learn in organizations. So gamification of learning has been a theme of the last 10 or 15 years, or probably more than that. So the game side of it from a commercial perspective is just about okay. The war side of it, however, is generally, you don't call it a war game because war games are not things people understand. They look at them as, they don't really know what they are, but they probably think of them as being like a toy soldier activity. And also war is a word that we don't like to use in organizations. And it's interesting, Tom, you saying about the inherent competition that you get. Yes, you do get inherent competition when you create a red team and a blue team and they're competing against each other. But from the commercial side, what you often get when you put people into those red teams and blue teams, if they're playing, say, different organizations, is the realization that actually they can work together, and that they almost like becomes a collaborative. They can realize that it's not a win, it's not a win-lose. It can be a win-win. And sometimes you can see that realization happening in the room when people are playing these roles and they're thinking, actually, taking the competitive stance in this particular commercial situation might not be doing us any favors. If we work collaboratively, we might get better outcomes. Now, you can't do that. Well, I guess you can do that in a war game. It'd be quite interesting to explore that in a military perspective. So the war side of it and the competitive side of it in business tends to be a little bit different. So, often I wouldn't, while I label them as war games for people who know what they're talking about, I would tend to talk to somebody who hadn't seen them before. I'd probably say a decision-making exercise or a strategic planning exercise. I wouldn't necessarily use the word war or game in that perspective, because that becomes quite a hard sell, to be truthful. And it's not just about that problem. It's not just about that problem solving bit either, is it? The problem solving part is really important, but you want people to be able to solve problems. But really, it's about their ability to envisage what that future, what the future looks like, and find a path to get there. And of course, on the way, they do solve problems on the way. So it's all those things are rolled into it. So there's lots of common ground, isn't there, between the military and commercial world with this? It's really fascinating.
That was actually going to be my next question. What is the common ground? Tom and I have talked about what can the military gain from a war game. What can businesses gain from a war game? Let's list them. Let's see how much common ground there is.
Well, I mean, I can give you some really quickly, Rich, on top of my head. They're great for stimulating creativity. If you put people in a scenario-based decision-making exercises, they can be creative with a solution. Because it's a safe space, as you've said, it's a chance for them to make the suggestion that they wouldn't normally have the balls to make when they're sitting around the board table. If you take, for instance, the senior managers and you put them into one team, and you take the next level of management down and put them into another team, you've got people who've got things to prove. You've got a personal agenda that stimulates some of the competition that goes on. Really good for spotlighting talent. They're really good for promoting resilience, to get the organizations into the mindset of how to deal with a problem. No, but we were doing, for Richard, you might remember, you and I ran about 10 years, 12 years ago, we ran some simulations around pandemics. We did some pandemic exercises for businesses. Great, really interesting from our perspective. At that time, to be fair, I think the businesses were very accommodating because they thought this is interesting stuff, but they didn't see the benefit. I mean, pandemic exercises, look at what we've had for the last couple of years. So you get this plausibility of scenario. They're promoting resilience, the ability to react and to almost like create those connections in the mind. That means when you're in a certain situation, you've got some kind of confidence about the decisions you're going to make. So it's good for challenging the existing thinking from that perspective as well. Great for encouraging teamwork, because you're getting people to work together, bringing people that perhaps don't normally work together. Perhaps you can do this globally. We're very lucky now to be able to do these things over Zoom and using Discord for commercial games as well. So you can bring teams together in a way that you wouldn't normally be able to do. And the other side of it is they're quite good. You get quite a good return on your investment for this. They're not cheap things to do, but actually there's a whole stack of things that come out at the end of it if organizations approach them in a mature way. And it is about that culture thing, as Tom was saying. Is that enough common ground? Blind spots is the other one, I think, really good for identifying blind spots and underpinning some of those, questioning some of those assumptions that we make. We can use a matrix gaming approach. So one of the things we might do in a commercial war game is perhaps say, tell us what you're going to do, and give us 3 reasons why it will work. That's the kind of classic matrix approach, isn't it? And of course, what they're doing by what we're doing there by saying to somebody, give us 3 reasons why it works, is we're asking people to reveal their assumptions behind their thinking. So we can say, we will launch a new product range in the North American market with great success. The reasons this will work are that we've got a great network of US distributors. We're supporting the launch with a large advertising campaign. And there's nothing similar on the market at this time, and demand is high. So 3 really good reasons why it will work. What we're able to do in the war game, of course, is take those away and say, okay, let's look at those 3 assumptions. Do we really have a great network of US distributors, or are we just conning ourselves? Does advertising really promote sales? and what is the true situation with demand. So we can expose a bit of groupthink as well, which I think is also common ground when you analyze the decisions that are being made and the way they're being made, and also the behaviors of people in the room as well. Loads of it, in other words.
I absolutely, I mean, we can change some of the terminology, but I'd say myself and Nick are very much on the same page here. In the very first instance, I'll start with critical thinking and analysis. Here's a problem. Break it down, deconstruct this problem, pull it apart, look at the constituent elements of this problem, and tell me why those are important and what they mean. After that, problem solving. There's the problem. You've analyzed it. You understand the problem. Now give me solutions to this problem. After you've given me decisions or solutions to this problem, I need you to make a decision and actually run with that decision, enact that decision. Tell me what it is you want to do to solve the problem that you've analyzed using the course of action that you've selected. And those are absolutely critical. And then flowing out of that, or underpinning all of that, in the first thing, it will be teamwork, because we work as staffs, various cells. You've the ops cell, the in cell, the log cell, the administrative cell, all of whom are working with their own decision-making or their own critical analysis tools and estimates, feeding into a complex problem to a complex answer to a complex problem. So you've critical thinking, problem solving, decision making that are underpinned by the teamwork. And then after that decision making is made, you have leadership from whoever's actually making the decision. And then those who go and enact it. And then and this is the critical piece for me in terms of my takeaway after 5 years of an instructor, when we move from that kind of more rigid analytical research type wargaming in inverted commas, that's so critical to our doctrinal piece, into that educational piece, is we cross the start line. We're now in a live environment. And so there are consequences to your decisions. And when those consequences keep coming, you have to keep doing that cycle. You have to keep making decisions. And you have to, and these are the final critical pieces I will give you, you have to display responsibility for your decisions, and you have to demonstrate resilience, because those consequences of those decisions will keep coming, and you need to keep making them, and you need to keep going until you've reached the end of whatever it is that you're doing in terms of a successful conclusion to your operation, be that tactical or your strategic campaign, or I'm sure Nick will say to whatever, commercial foray that you're making. So to summate that, critical thinking and analysis, problem solving, decision making, resilience, responsibility, teamwork, and leadership. Nick, I'd be fairly confident that those attributes or advantages to conducting wargaming or simulation or whatever title that you want to put it on that tool that we're talking about in terms of how you work through a problem and you play it out, will cross over into your sphere of business.
Yeah, absolutely right. I'd agree that 150%. And also the landscape on which these things are nailed down, I think across the military world, I think in the commercial world, and I know also in the Kriegspiel sort of hobby wargaming world, is the thing that runs through the whole lot is this concept of friction. The friction that you get in all these operations, friction, the gap between what we expect to achieve and what we actually achieve. The kind of three classic gaps, aren't they? The difference between what we would like to know and what we actually know, and the difference between what we want people to do and what they will actually do. And they show up in all of those commercial, military, or hobby games. And in fact, the really good ones show those up, really front and center.
Nick and Richard, the one bit that I left out there, and I think the critical piece when we talk about wargaming as a tool, as an analytical tool, or as an entity that spans across both the spheres that we're talking about here, both military and commercial this evening, is that those are common, right? The analytical, critical thinking, the problem solving, decision making, the responsibility, resilience, teamwork, and leadership. Those are all key. The subject matter then is the final piece of the pie. Yeah. Okay. And that's equally important from a takeaway. Yeah. Okay. So in our sense, in a professional military sense, that subject matter can be those lessons gleaned, the fundamentals and principles of conducting a battalion or a battle group level obstacle crossing, or a conventional brigade in attack, or a brigade in defense, or a peacekeeping operation in a non-permissive environment, or whatever it is. Yeah, the subject matter on which we are actually engaging with, there's a host of takeaways to be had from there too. And that's the really specific piece that we'll get. And it's where I would suggest you kind of move from that educational training wargaming sphere of my graph into the analytical research piece, because it's specific to the problem. Those other benefits, yeah, are more generalized, yeah, and all of them have value to us. Yeah.
Are we making an error here in terms of dressing this up with lots of very serious and worthy terms like analytical tools, and are we using these wordy phrases to make a war game appear to be serious? And in doing so, are we missing out on the fact that a simple war game can actually put an individual person in an operational or tactical situation where they have to make on-the-spot decisions, where what you're describing, Tom, is a large organization that's putting all these different pods and cells who are working together, all contributing to the whole. But when we look back at the original Kriegspiel and we look back at von Moltke's exercises that he wrote in the 1860s, I guess, where he was actually putting that in front of subalterns and saying, right, you're leading a troop of cavalry down a road, and here's a snippet of the map of the area, and you, in the distance, you see whatever you see. How do you respond to that? Are we missing out on those by making things very, very serious and worthy? Are we missing out on an opportunity to actually use very small map-based games as a way of training individual leaders? And is that something that happens? Because I know that when I first was involved in got involved with the process of developing the Camberley Kriegspiel for the British Army, I talked to the Major General who was heading that process, and he said to me, do you know what he said? What I did is I created a little war game for my section leaders, and I got the boys in the section having to take part, and they'd say, right, you know, the guy who couldn't run very fast, they gave him the GPMG because he would be the one creating the base of fire, and the guy who was really good at cricket, he's the one they sent forward to chuck the grenades over the whatever it is. And what he was describing to me was actually, why don't we get military personnel playing Warhammer? Because if they're playing Warhammer, they're developing intellectual skills in terms of decision making and understanding the basic tenets of the military trade without getting involved in highfalutin ideas. Are we missing out because we are afraid to say, let's put a simple war game on the table? What would be recognizable to a recreational war gamer, and then just play that out with a couple of subalterns and say, right, guys, we're doing this because it's an opportunity for you to think about the basics of your trade or art, call it whatever you will.
I think I don't know if I'd agree with that. I would suggest to both you, to you and certainly to Nick, that it doesn't matter what level the scenario is, or the game in inverted commas, and I'm not necessarily comfortable with that terminology, but it doesn't matter what level it's pitched at. It can be, in our case, Aut 8 Murphy and the rifle section conducting the simplest of military problems, which is there's 2 guys or 3 guys under that tree 500 yards away. How do we get from here to there and deal with them? Yeah, okay. Or it can be far more complex and say there's 1,500 people in this armored battle group. How do we do conventional obstacle crossing and attack, or whatever it is. I'm sure Nick will have similar scaled problems or challenges from the business world. I think the biggest revelation that I've had after looking back on reflection over the 5 years of teaching is that those characteristics, those benefits that we've listed over the last number of minutes, they're applicable whatever. That's what we're actually doing. If we were to stand back, even when I'm playing, chain of command on the kitchen table with whoever virtually online or in person, that's what we're actually doing. There is a squad there or a weapon system there. I have X, Y, and Z at my disposal within the confines of the sandbox, the rule set, the table, the scenario that we're playing. How do we deal with that? That's the analytical, critical thinking piece. The problem solving is, well, I can do X and then I'll do Y, and I need X to happen before Y happens. That's the problem solving bit. The decision making is the decision in what phase or what turn to do that, under what circumstances. And then admittedly, okay, the teamwork piece might be I'm acting on my own. But the resilience piece, when it goes wrong or it doesn't go wrong, to adapt and overcome that and keep going, all of those remain the same. So I would propose it to you both that we can situate this discussion at whatever level we want. It will remain the same. Now, the actual nuts and bolts of whatever game that we're doing or scenario that we're playing, or the amount of facilitation or the amount of background reading or the amount of aids to conduct that activity, all of that will scale appropriately in complexity, cost, and quantity. But the fundamental principles, I would argue, remain exactly the same. And you're right, it does have as much benefit for the individual, in our sense, I would suggest, and on my reflection, for the individual rifleman or the corporal or the lieutenant colonel. And across the board.
And people are doing these things all the time without knowing that they're doing it. So, for instance, if I have a fire alarm, if I have a fire practice at work, and I choose to say, we're going to do a fire practice, but this time, Ted, you're going to stand by the back stairs and tell people that stairway is out of use. Well, what you're really doing is creating a scenario for those people to go through a series of decision-making exercises about how they get out of the building. You are presenting them with, if you like, the very bottom rung on the wargaming ladder. You're giving
Powering
them...
Inferno, the war game.
Yeah, that's right. That's what you're giving them. You're giving them an exercise to stimulate their thinking, and then after, so if they all stand in the corridor like sheep, then there's something going on, isn't there? So, for instance, I had a talking over Christmas lunch, actually, funny enough, to a guy that I used to work with, and we were talking from a health and safety perspective, and he was talking about continuity exercises and exactly this issue. They had a stairway in the building that people were not allowed to use. You're not allowed to use the staircase. You're not allowed to use the staircase. And of course, it was an emergency exit. When they had a fire, nobody used that exit because they were just hardwired into not being allowed to use it. And there's no reason that they couldn't use it apart from the fact that it went past the MD's office and he didn't like people going up and down the stairs. So we get really tied into these set ways of doing things really easily, and just applying a simple deviation to that on a kind of throwing in a what we call a bit of friction makes people approach things in a different way. And it can be any level, as I say. You can take it from that entry level where we're doing a blocking a fire exit. And Richard, you and I have done this through to big security exercises based on continuity plans.
I think there's a story, isn't there, about two officers from different regiments at a mess night dinner, and both of them happen to go to the gents at the same time, and one of them finishes what he's doing and goes to go straight out, and the other one looks over his shoulder and says, in our regiment, it's traditional to wash our hands when we finished in the bathroom. And the other one says, well, in my regiment, it's traditional not to piss on our fingers. And you do wonder whether organizations have that, they have their own way of doing things, and is there room with the military doctrines that you professionals operate within the confines of? Is there room for disruptors in those military war games, or are people simply conforming to the rules that they think they have to conform to? Now, let me give you an example here. I was involved in doing some play testing on a military war game system, and I decided that I was going to call in an artillery barrage because I wanted to assault a particular geographical area, and I was shouted down in the politest possible way and told, that's not how we do it. That's not how we do it. We don't just use artillery in that manner. It's now all about identifying high value targets, conducting surgical strikes, and that is how modern warfare is done. And my argument at the time was, but you're telling me what your organization does. In this game, I'm red and you're blue. I'm not your military organization. I'm my own military organization. And if you're developing a game that is meant to encompass what can happen in warfare, you have to go outside the boundaries of your own doctrine. And I'm wondering, is that a problem for military organizations?
Yeah, there's an inherent, I mean, certainly if you pull it back and you say, I know it's earlier you were talking about the adversarial piece and the red blue part of it, and I hear, look, from where we're teaching it, like it is that red blue scenario, certainly at battalion and battle group and brigade level. That's where we're situating yourself within a conventional space, and in that conventional space, yeah, I mean, we have doctrine, and doctrine is how we intend to do business, how we do business. And you know, everyone has a doctrine, including potential adversaries. And so if you're looking to conduct or walk through an operation fictitiously against an enemy, and if that enemy or that adversary has a doctrine, and somebody is playing, in inverted commas, the role of that enemy commander or that adversarial commander, well then, is there not then a requirement, and for it to be, you know, broadly within the confines of what we'd expect to happen, that the constraints imposed upon them by that which we understand to be their doctrine going to take an effect or have an effect on it? So yes, like, do you want to think outside the box? Well, that's part and parcel of it. We want to work within the adversarial nature of it. We want opposition. We want friction. We want the unknown. We want to find strengths and weaknesses in any given plan. In order for that to happen, well, then, you know, the other side needs to put their best foot forward in order to try and, as best possible, find those gaps and flaws and inconsistencies in our own plan. But they're going to do that according to a playbook of sorts. The degree to which you can thread that line, though, is an interesting one. And I would suggest that in the level of the game, or the game being played, that might be more difficult than others, i.e. at the lower level, whereby perhaps actions are more defined in that original conventional sense. Well, then, yeah, there's a script of how you would expect people in terms of how we do business and how everyone else does business, and that you broadly expect that, you know, that's what you're planning against, and, you know, all well and good. At the higher levels and in varying different types of games, then there's obviously far more scope for that, you know, what you're talking about in terms of that like absolute red herring or that real left field you know, decisions to occur. That's a really interesting one. I need to ponder that more, but certainly from my experience, where we're looking at those analytical research pieces, and it's certainly within the context of a conventional exercise, looking at a conventional course of action against a conventional problem and a conventional adversary. The doctrinal piece, into some degree, does, you know, it is the touchstone for the intelligence officer who's going to champion or run that team to play by. Yeah, Nick?
Yeah, well, I was thinking about what Richard was saying there also about that whole piece about disruptors and how predictable outcomes can be.
Yeah.
So if many people behave in a predictable way, the outcomes become predictable. So we know this in wargaming. We know the kind of distribution of possible outcomes that happen. And while people are making decisions that are not out of the ordinary and that we can expect to have thought about beforehand in terms of the game design, the game doesn't really stretch any boundaries, does it? People do what's expected of them. But as soon as you get that disruptor, and it normally is an individual, who's got a bit of out of the box thinking or got their own agenda, or they do something that 9 out of 10 other people in that situation would not do, then two things have to happen. First thing is that, well, what is the consequence of that action? How does that show up? And of course, one of the things that does is it stretches the boundary of the game design and of the the rules or the umpire team about, Christ, what does happen now that this person's that they've chosen to do this? What happens next? And so that creates creativity, creative thinking in its own. So you can break games, you can break war games, and I know people try to do that. That can happen. And the other side of that is that, it's the ability to cope with those disruptors and then say, well, where did that come from? To what extent was that, culture specific, or is it individual? There are, well, we talk about things that are, the creators of friction. You get these kind of, imperfect information that can create a decision, create a really wild and wacky decision. We've seen it in war games that we've run in the hobby sphere, Richard, where you give somebody an inject and they do something completely that you weren't expecting, simply because they've misunderstood or got a different agenda to the information you've given them. But you think, well, okay, yeah, fine, you can make that decision, we'll see where that goes. You can run with that. But you can really pick up on some of the assumptions behind their thinking. I always think, for instance, when we're in a kind of commercial basis, whenever anybody says the word always and never, oh, well, that always works, or we'll never get any work with them because X, Y, and Z. As soon as you hear the ways always and never, you've got something to challenge. You've got an easy picking in terms of challenge assumptions to go with that. So I don't know. It's a whole complex area. It's a real big box you've opened there, mate.
Well, this is what I'm thinking. You see, in May 1940, when the Germans invade Belgium, the Chasseurs d'Ardennais, the Belgian forest Jaeger, are there to delay them. And the Germans, what do? Do they attack them head on and allow the Belgians to blow up all the culverts and ornamental walls and whatever in their path? No, they put blokes in Fieseler Storch light aircraft and they fly them over the top of the Belgian defenders. And they're flying them over like 2 or 3 or maybe 4 guys in these Fieselers, the fleet of tiny light reconnaissance aircraft, and inserting their men in that manner. And you think that's not normal behavior. And had they been sticking to their doctrines, and had you wargamed that and stuck to your doctrines, you wouldn't do that. And that concerns me, because in reality, people do break rules.
Yeah, and a point I want to come back on really quickly on that, Rich, if I can, because it's come back into my head about those assumptions and how those doctrines affect things. Jumping into the hobby sphere for a minute, whenever we've run Kriegspiels around World War II, for instance, as you know, I'm quite strict on running red and blue and not calling them Americans and Germans. And the reason for that is because, people will always say a heavy, if I say an enemy heavy tank has appeared, that's the difference to saying a tiger has appeared. No. Because it puts a different way of working in people's heads. They think what a tiger can do. If you have aerial combats, they start to think about Mustangs versus Messerschmitts, and they start to go what I call going on brand. They start to pick on branded products that the armies have that they're using against each other, and as we know, they have different technical specifications. Whereas, in theory, red heavy cavalry versus blue heavy cavalry, well, actually, you should think of those as being, to all intents and purposes, the same beast, because otherwise you skew their thinking by lots of preconceptions about the differences between Russian heavy cavalry and French heavy cavalry, which while that might be really relevant for the war game, doesn't necessarily help you if you're trying to model something. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I double in with Nick there, Richard. I think the key bit here is in terms of like, and you were talking about that example of the German troops in those light aircraft overflying the French defenders. Like where did that come from in terms of like the level of ingenuity that would be required to conceptualize that solution to a problem? Yeah, and I think that's very much, at least in my own experience, like it stems from the degree of constraint or otherwise that's imposed upon whatever game or design or scenario that you're playing, the level that it's pitched at, and what, coming back to Nick's point, the level of abstraction that's involved with it. Yeah. Okay. In terms of, if the game is at quite a high level with very loose interpretations of what is or is not possible by the players, well, then that encourages the freedom of thought. If I am very much centered in as X role player, i.e. an operations element, a staff officer of a said battalion type with said equipment tables, said things, technical limitations, all the rest of it, that will constrain the potential solutions for which I'm going to come up to the problem that I'm dealing with. Yeah. So I'd absolutely double down on Nick's point in terms of the abstraction and how important that is. And obviously this is all linked to what we are attempting to take away from the game. Are we looking for a specific problem to a very specific solution to a very specific problem? Are we talking about conceptualizing potential solutions to whatever given problem that we're doing in an abstracted nature? Yeah.
And Richard, what that point that you're making about that decision about putting those guys in those light aircraft, where did that decision come from? I would argue that, in an organization that is wargaming, where junior leaders are being challenged with decisions, where they're creating an atmosphere of sort of briefing back up the chain of command about ideas, you've probably got a culture where it's okay for a fairly junior officer to say, it's like the alpha track tactic, isn't it? We know what the intent is. We know what the intent is, so let's try and do this. And the senior commander will say, yeah, great idea, let's do it. If you have a culture where they're not doing that, I would argue, where they're not doing that wargaming, where they haven't got that openness of culture, those ideas are not going to come to the surface. They're going to remain zipped behind a set of lips that somebody's too scared to mention. And this is the history of failed campaigns throughout history, isn't it? Where people have known what's going wrong at the time it's going wrong, but they haven't been able to step up and do anything about it because the people at the top are just not listening.
Yeah, it's interesting, actually. Just as we've been having this conversation, I've been thinking, well, do you know what? That idea might have come from a war game, because the German army, after the First World War, the German army had been using war games for 50 years by that point. Nearly 100 years by that point. But after the First World War, despite the fact the army of the Treaty of Versailles being much, much smaller, that actually gave wargaming a huge boost in the German army, because they had to develop theories based on something, and they didn't have an air force and they didn't have tanks, so they used war games to develop their theories. So once they came to a point that, here's a checkbook, go and buy what you need, they'd already developed their ideas because of the use of wargaming. And you think, actually, how is it that we've gone from military organizations that saw wargaming as the key to making real serious decisions to the point where we are today, where sometimes it's viewed rather dubiously. Now you can look at the Western Approaches tactical unit that the British Army had during the Wolfpack campaign that the Kriegsmarine were undertaking, and really putting Britain as a nation under pressure because of the amount of tonnage of food and supplies that was going to the bottom. The Royal Navy actually used wargaming to develop a solution to that as the campaign was ongoing. And yet, once the end of the Second World War comes, virtually the whole thing stops, and somehow the military loses sight of it. And it's interesting that industry seems to have, in the last 10 years, maybe 20 years, industry seems to be more comfortable with taking wargaming and exploring exactly what they can do with it, or almost from a blank sheet of paper. whereas the military seem to shy away from it a little bit. You know, the idea, that term game suggests something infantile. It suggests something that's fun, and the military feel we're not here to have fun. This is a serious business, and these are people's lives. But somehow they're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. What do you think would make wargaming more attractive and more accessible to military organisations, Tom?
It's not that it's. Again, I'll come back to a point that I made earlier on. I might suggest that it's not that it's unattractive; it's just misunderstood.
Yeah,
and that's the key bit. Yeah, understanding of the benefits that it brings, the accessibility that can be there with it, the fact that we're doing it anyway. I mean, like, you know, nearly all. I mean, we all play chess, right? I mean, or most people have ever played chess. Chess is a war game. Yeah, okay. Like, you know, we do this. We what we need is a greater understanding of it, greater clarity in terms of the benefits that it can bring, and then more accessible war games at all levels. And really, that can stop at the top down, move from the top down as well as from the bottom up. Yeah, and I think that will go a long way towards doing that. How you get about doing that? I mean, you need to. I mean, like most things. I mean, I would suggest, you know, militaries are, by and large, slightly conservative organizations. We don't do change very radically. We tend to move. We do change. We just do it sometimes very slowly, yeah, unless there's a significant outside added impetus. So in order to bring it in, I think you need to kind of start low, put officer and other ranks levels, and inculcate it in them over the course of their career. And that's a generational or 2-generational shift to try and do that. And I think the single starting point is, from our perspective, yeah, is that the war game is a tool to decision making and problem solving. It does a host of other things as well, a host of other things, yeah. And if we can use it as a tool to aid better understanding of that, then I think we're in a really good place. I think we're moving to a better place. Yeah. As a core kind of component. And then obviously, as I said, it does all those other things as well. And that might be a starting point. Yeah. How that happens in practical terms, you know, you need to roll it out, you need to push it out there, you need to advertise it, you need to get practical engagement with it. And I think that's a huge winner. I mean, like the physical optics of it, the tactile engagement of playing a game, and that can be hex encounters or it can be figures, it doesn't matter. And certainly, I'd also, I mean, I'm coming back to my own experience, like, you know, the way our understanding of teaching and educational methods and how people learn. Yeah. And the move away from, you know, rote lectures delivered ad nauseum from a podium into other forms of learning, like tactile learning, doing decision making, syndicate room discussions, you know, talks, engagement, all that type of stuff. This is another brilliant way of engaging people and educating them. Yeah.
Good teachers make learning fun.
And absolutely. And this can be, when done properly, a very fun way of learning.
Nick?
Yeah, I was nodding my head through all of that, because it's really just about creating that culture of learning, isn't it? Which is, you know, has multi aspects to it. Yes, you've got exercises you can run, but it's also small interventions. You know, Tom was saying there all the things about organizational change that you'd also hear discussed in the commercial world. You know, just start to drip feed some of these changes in. They will become centers where they become advocates of them. They will see the benefits. It becomes part of the culture over time. All these things are there to grow from it. It's interesting, Rich, from the commercial side, that, you know, the OODA loop has reappeared in recent times with instead of the OODA, which the military know and love and understand. It's back in use in the commercial world, but with the original O being changed for S for a scan. So instead of observe, orientate, decide, and act, it's been swallowed up in the commercial world by Boston Consulting Group. they're calling it SODA: scan, orient, decide, and act. But it's exactly the same loop. You know, these things, the principles are the same no matter what sphere you're moving in.
Well, and I think that is interesting to see how common ideas being rebranded in order to be resold. Tom, in summary.
In summary, wargaming and the military. Yes, it's a challenge. Ironic, I suppose, maybe surprisingly, but it is potentially a tool that we can use to further our learning, our education, our decision making, our problem solving, our critical thinking or analysis, our resilience and responsibility, teamwork and leadership. All of those absolutely fundamental core attributes and you know, fundamental principles that we need to have in order to function like we do. Wargaming as a tool demonstrates, illustrates, and educates on all of those various pieces. Yeah, okay. And if we can get ourselves to a position whereby we can recognize its utility in aiding us to doing, you know, in terms of teaching ourselves and teaching our subordinates and teaching our future leaders, yeah, of all ranks, on those topics, well then that's a really good place to be in. And I think the key part is that it is a tool like many other tools that we have. And if we can get to a position whereby we recognize its utility as another tool in our toolbox to do that as a means of teaching and educating, then I think it has immense benefit to give us. Yeah.
So, Tom, you're here shouting the corner for military wargaming. Nick, you're shouting the corner for business wargaming. I've been involved in all three, but I guess that means that I'm here to represent recreational wargaming. What have you guys got to teach me? What can I learn from business wargaming? What can I, the recreational wargamer, learn from military wargaming?
That's a very difficult question.
It is, and it is. And that's why I saved it till last.
That's a real stumper, Nick.
I think what the hobby wargamer, if I could, can I use that term? Can I use that?
Yep.
I think what the hobby wargamer brings with him, and I think of this now through my own experience and my own journey in this sphere. The hobby wargamer brings with them a really rich experience in doing this stuff. So, you know, for instance, I've long designed war games and war game scenarios since I was a teenager. But it took me another 20 years to realize that same principle of skills that I had in scenario design could port across into scenario design in the commercial world. As soon as I realized that was, you know, that was a gift that God had given me, or you know, something that a skill that I had in my toolbox, I suddenly realized actually I can apply this at work and I can start to improve the surroundings and the culture of the place that I work. I can apply this learning, and also I can have some fun doing it as well, because, you know, one of the things we say about hobby wargaming is it's fun. And I think your work should be fun. Now, fun in the military, and not let's not have that conversation. But you know, it should have purpose and meaning. Maybe let's put it that way. And I can apply more meaning to my work by giving it more focus by doing that. And as soon as I realized that actually these things, these skills and these attributes I picked up by hobby gaming, I can apply them into that real world of work. You know, you suddenly think, well, hang on a minute, I'm doing something really powerful here.
Absolutely, but that's what wargaming has taught you. What can you teach hobby wargaming from your world of business wargaming? Because it's intriguing how close business wargaming and military wargaming are. There are so many of the same benefits that you can get. There are so many of the same tools that you can use. But maybe I think the key issue in hobby wargaming is that people who are doing it have bought into it. So it isn't the hard sell, because the hard sell's already been done. People have committed to doing this and they want to do it. And that certainly, in my experience, means it's a lot easier running war games for wargamers And actually, I hate to say it, but in many ways, they're far more knowledgeable than the professional military officers that I've been involved with in terms of their knowledge of what's gone before, not necessarily their knowledge of how to do it today. But is there something that we can learn?
Here I can. I'm reflecting on my own experience over the last 5 years of personal and professional wargaming, and I has one. It's a bit of a symbiotic relationship, surely. I mean, you could say it's a busman's holiday, right? Yeah, depending which way the bus is going, But in many ways, my professional understanding of the applicability of wargaming and how to run them and how the mechanics behind them, the dynamics, and how we manage all of that has been deepened by what I do in my own time for personal pleasure and enjoyment, of wargaming with like-minded people, and doing that activity. I would say, going on the other direction, I have, without question, taken the professional knowledge that I've been given from the military sphere, in terms of everything from planning and executing and organizing an exercise into the conduct of a campaign over a number of weeks with my friends, or aiding in the transfer and the how you would scope and then lay out and report a Kriegspiel campaign, or information to players in terms of the fundamentals of how we do military reporting, and our reporting in the military in terms of clarity, accuracy, brevity, and all the rest of it, in terms of managing the effects, talking about the effects and what we want to achieve or otherwise, all those bits. In terms of my understanding of the mechanics of how various things happen in a military sphere onto a tabletop, deepening and I dare say, and I don't want to use the term, but realism of what it is that we're looking to represent.
I wonder if that you raise an interesting point there. I wonder if game is a dirty word for the military, and realism is a dirty word for the recreational gamer. It's interesting that we
I don't think it is. I really don't think realism is a dirty word for the recreational gamer. I mean, I think that one of the things, I think one of the things that draws people towards good historical war games is the fact that they feel it's giving them a realistic decision-making challenge. They feel it's realistic. The feedback we get, Richard, from guys buying Too Fat Large products is that they like the challenge it gives them. We know that a lot of people that have got military experience like to play a lot of the games that we've taken to the market, and that is, that's a connection point, isn't it? There's something about that. I don't know what it says, but it says that there's a connection there between the challenge that you're providing people with.
I think that's a really good point, and I think you've answered my question. And for a moment, I thought I'd got you both stumped there, but I think you're right. What the military experience can give recreational wargamers is that point of contact with understanding the decisions that need to be made, understanding what options are presented at that point of being under pressure. So, interesting, gentlemen. I think we've talked around this one for long enough now. Thank you very much for joining me in the ops room for our very first opportunity to give the tent a run out. I hope you've enjoyed the opportunity to talk through these fairly pithy issues. And let me say thank you to you, the listener, for staying with us. And we'll look forward to seeing you in the ops room at some point in the future.